Behind the golden crown and silk robes of one of England's most powerful monarchs lay a secret too horrifying to speak aloud. King Henry VIII, the man who reshaped a nation and defied the Catholic Church itself, was slowly being consumed by his own flesh. While courtiers bowed and ambassadors trembled, the king's body was rotting from within, harboring wounds that would not heal and a mind that grew darker with each passing year. This is not the story of Henry's 6 wives or his political triumphs. This is the story of a living nightmare trapped inside a failing body. When Henry Tudor ascended to the throne in 1509 at the age of 17, he was the very picture of Renaissance masculinity. Standing over 6 feet tall in an era when the average man barely reached 5.5 feet, the young king towered over his court. His auburn hair caught the light like burnished copper, and his athletic frame spoke of hours spent in the tilt yard and tennis court. Ambassadors from across Europe wrote home in awestruck terms, describing a monarch who seemed more god than man. The Venetian ambassador declared him the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on, while others marveled at his prowess in jousting, his skill with the bow, and his seemingly inexhaustible energy. This golden prince spent his days hunting in the forests of England, dancing until dawn at lavish court festivities, and composing music that would be played for centuries. He could speak Latin, French, and Spanish fluently, debate theology with scholars, and outride any man in his kingdom. His court was a spectacle of magnificence, where gold cloth glittered in torchlight and the air rang with laughter and music. Henry VIII in his youth was everything a Renaissance king should be: powerful, learned, vigorous, and seemingly invincible. The future stretched before him like an endless summer day, full of promise and glory. But hidden within this perfect specimen of manhood was a ticking clock, a biological catastrophe waiting to unfold. The same vigorous body that could dance for hours and unhorse opponents in the lists carried genetic predispositions that would, in time, transform him into something unrecognizable. The strong legs that carried him across hunting grounds would one day barely support his weight. The keen mind that debated with theologians would cloud with paranoia and rage. And the handsome face that charmed foreign dignitaries would become a mask of pain, hiding the decay that spread beneath his skin. The transformation began not with a dramatic incident, but with a series of accidents that seemed, at first, merely unfortunate. In 1524, during a jousting tournament at Greenwich, a lance struck Henry's helmet with such force that it filled with water, nearly drowning him before his attendants could remove it. The king recovered quickly, but something had changed. He began to suffer from severe headaches, episodes of blurred vision, and occasional memory lapses. His courtiers noticed that the king's famous charm could now, without warning, give way to sudden bursts of frightening anger. Then came the disaster that would mark the true beginning of Henry's physical decline. On January 24, 1536, while jousting at Greenwich Palace, the king's horse fell, and the full weight of both animal and armored rider crashed down upon him. Henry lay unconscious for 2 hours. When he finally awoke, he complained of agonizing pain in his left leg. The royal physicians examined the limb and discovered something that would haunt the king for the rest of his life: a deep wound that had torn through muscle and possibly damaged the bone itself. They dressed the wound, applied poultices, and assured their sovereign that he would heal. But the wound refused to close. This injury occurred when Henry was 44 years old, still vigorous despite his earlier accidents, still capable of leading his court in revels and hunts. Within months, however, the wound in his thigh became something far worse than a simple injury. It developed into what contemporary physicians called a fistula, an abnormal tunnel of infected tissue that burrowed deep into his leg. The wound would weep constantly, producing foul-smelling discharge that soaked through bandages and required constant attention from his physicians. The pain was relentless, a burning agony that never truly subsided, only varied in its intensity. As the ulcer on his leg festered and spread, Henry's entire body began to change. The athletic frame that had once inspired awe started to thicken and swell. Without the ability to exercise as he once had, without the long days of hunting and dancing that had kept him lean, the king's body began to store fat at an alarming rate. His face grew rounder, his neck thicker, until the strong jaw that had once been his most distinctive feature began to disappear beneath folds of flesh. His doublets had to be constantly altered, let out to accommodate his expanding girth, and eventually replaced altogether when no amount of alteration could make them fit. The transformation from athletic youth to corpulent invalid happened with shocking speed, as if his body, once denied its accustomed activity, had turned against him with vengeful fury. The wound in Henry's leg became the dark center around which his life revolved. Each morning began with the unwrapping of bandages, a process the king had come to dread. His physicians would carefully remove the linen strips that had been soaked in various medicinal preparations throughout the night, revealing the angry, weeping flesh beneath. The stench was overwhelming, a combination of rotting tissue, infection, and the various herbs and compounds used to treat it. Sweet-smelling herbs were burned constantly in the king's chambers, not merely for ceremony, but to mask the odor of decay that emanated from the royal body. The Tudor physicians, working with the limited medical knowledge of their era, tried everything. They applied poultices made from bread and milk to draw out infection. They packed the wound with honey, believing in its healing properties. They used caustic substances to burn away diseased tissue, a process so agonizing that even the king, who prided himself on his courage, would grip the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned white. They inserted probes and drainage tubes, attempting to provide an outlet for the constant flow of pus. They bled him regularly, following the medical theory that an imbalance of humors caused disease, removing blood that his weakening body could ill afford to lose. Historical records from Henry's personal physicians reveal the true horror of his condition. The wound measured several inches in depth and diameter, a gaping hole in his thigh that extended deep into the muscle tissue. Around its edges, the skin was red and inflamed, radiating heat that spoke of the infection burning beneath. The surrounding flesh had become thickened and discolored, marked by the constant irritation of bandages and treatments. Sometimes the fistula would appear to close, giving the king and his doctors brief hope, only to break open again days later, often with renewed severity. Each time it reopened, Henry would be confined to his chambers, unable to walk, sometimes unable even to rise from his bed. But the leg wound was not Henry's only physical torment. As he aged, more ulcers appeared on his body. His other leg developed a similar wound, though not quite as severe. Sores appeared on his arms and torso, some healing relatively quickly, others persisting for months or years. His physicians noted that any injury, no matter how minor, would take an abnormally long time to heal. A simple scratch might become infected, a bruise might develop into an abscess. It was as if his body had lost the ability to repair itself, as if the very mechanisms that should have knitted his flesh together had been switched off. Modern medical analysis of the historical evidence suggests that Henry may have suffered from a condition known as chronic venous insufficiency, where the veins in the legs fail to properly return blood to the heart. This would explain why the wounds refused to heal and why they wept constantly. Some historians and physicians have also suggested that he may have had osteomyelitis, a deep bone infection that can turn ordinary wounds into persistent ulcers. Others have proposed that he suffered from Cushing's syndrome, a hormonal disorder that causes obesity, poor wound healing, and dramatic personality changes. Still others point to type 2 diabetes, which would account for his weight gain, his poor healing, and his increasingly erratic behavior. Whatever the exact medical cause, the result was the same. Henry VIII spent the last decade of his life in constant, unrelenting pain. The agony in his legs was always present, a dull burning that could, without warning, flare into white-hot torment. He could no longer walk any significant distance. When he moved through his palaces, It was with the aid of a walking stick or, increasingly, carried in a chair by specially appointed servants. The once mighty hunter who had ridden for hours now had to be winched up staircases by elaborate mechanical systems installed in his various residences. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of his chambers and the few rooms he could reach without too much pain. The constant pain did something worse than merely limit his mobility. It poisoned his personality, warping the jovial young king who had loved music and laughter into a suspicious, vengeful tyrant. Sleep became increasingly difficult. The pain would wake him in the night, and he would lie in the darkness, his mind churning with grievances and suspicions. His temper, once quick but easily soothed, became unpredictable and dangerous. Courtiers learned to gauge the king's mood by the severity of his pain, knowing that on days when his leg troubled him most, any small slight or perceived disrespect could result in imprisonment or worse. The physical suffering was compounded by the indignity of his condition. Henry had been raised to believe in the divine right of kings, in the idea that monarchs were chosen by God and thus elevated above ordinary men. Yet here he was, dependent on servants to dress him, to carry him, to clean his wounds. The same courtiers who bowed before him in public knew intimate details of his body's decay, had seen and smelled the corruption of his flesh. This humiliation ate at him, feeding his paranoia and his rage. He became obsessed with maintaining the appearance of majesty, even as his body betrayed him. His clothes grew more elaborate, his jewelry more ostentatious, as if he could disguise his physical decline beneath sufficient splendor. As Henry's leg ulcers refused to heal, his body began to swell with a different kind of corruption. By his early 50s, the king who had once been the model of athletic grace had become grotesquely obese. Historical records, including the measurements taken for his armor, tell the shocking story of his transformation. In his youth, Henry's waist measured 32 inches. By 1545, just 2 years before his death, his waist had expanded to 54 inches. His chest, once broad with muscle, had grown to 60 inches around. His weight, estimated by historians based on contemporary accounts and armor measurements, had ballooned from approximately 200 pounds in his prime to well over 350 pounds in his final years. The physical bulk of the king became a logistical nightmare for his household. Special chairs had to be constructed to support his weight, reinforced with extra timbers and wider than normal seats. His beds required custom frames, strong enough to support not just his enormous body, but the weights and pulley systems used to help him change position during the night. When he traveled, which became increasingly rare, his litters had to be carried by teams of strong men who would be regularly rotated to prevent exhaustion. The strain of moving the king was so great that special servants were appointed solely for this purpose, men chosen for their strength and stamina. Henry's clothing became a particular challenge. His doublets, the close-fitting jackets fashionable in Tudor England, had to be so large that they required unprecedented amounts of fabric. Records from the royal wardrobe show orders for silks and velvets in quantities that would have clothed several normal men. His hose, the tight-fitting leg coverings worn by Tudor gentlemen, had to be specially made and reinforced to contain his swollen legs without splitting. Even his shoes became an issue. His feet, bearing the weight of his massive body and swollen from poor circulation, required custom footwear that won contemporary description compared to small boats. The king's diet, rather than being restricted to address his weight gain, grew more elaborate and excessive. Henry had always loved food, but in his younger years, constant activity had kept his weight in check. Now unable to exercise, he continued to eat with the same enthusiasm, but none of the physical output to balance his consumption. A typical day's meals for the king might include breakfast of beef, mutton, or venison, accompanied by bread, cheese, and ale. His dinner, the main meal of the day, could feature multiple courses of roasted meats, game birds, fish dishes, pies, tarts, and sweetmeats. Supper would bring yet another array of dishes, often including the king's favorite delicacies. Historical accounts describe Henry's appetite as voracious. He would eat rapidly, consuming quantities that shocked even his well-fed courtiers. Sugar, newly fashionable and expensive in Tudor England, featured heavily in his diet. Sweetmeats, candied fruits, and elaborate sugar sculptures adorned his table. Wine flowed freely, with the king consuming several pints daily. His physicians, well aware that his diet contributed to his health problems, nevertheless dared not suggest significant restrictions. The king's temper, always dangerous, was particularly volatile when he was denied food or drink. The combination of massive weight gain and leg ulcers created a vicious cycle. The extra weight put additional pressure on his damaged legs, making the wounds worse and more painful. The worsening wounds further limited his mobility, leading to more weight gain. His physicians recognized the problem, but lacked both the medical knowledge and the authority to force the king to change his habits. They could only watch as their sovereign's body continued its catastrophic transformation, applying their useless poultices and bloodlettings while the king ate himself toward an early grave. The obesity brought its own constellation of health problems beyond the obvious issues of mobility and appearance. Henry began to suffer from severe shortness of breath, struggling to catch his wind after even minimal exertion. He snored prodigiously at night, his breathing so labored that it could be heard in the adjoining chambers. He sweated profusely, his body unable to properly regulate its temperature under the insulating layers of fat. Rashes and sores developed in the folds of his skin, adding to his discomfort and requiring yet more attention from his increasingly helpless physicians. Perhaps most distressing to the king was the loss of his masculine vigor. In his youth, Henry had been famously lustful, fathering several illegitimate children and maintaining a series of mistresses even while married. His pursuit of Anne Boleyn, his second wife, had driven him to break with the Catholic Church, but as his weight increased and his health declined, his sexual ability diminished. This failure was both humiliating and dangerous for his wives. Henry's inability to produce the male heir he so desperately wanted, combined with his diminishing potency, fed his paranoia about his wives' fidelity. If he could not satisfy them, he reasoned in his darkening mind, they must be seeking satisfaction elsewhere. This suspicion would contribute to the fates of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, both executed on charges of adultery that may have existed more in Henry's imagination than in reality. While Henry's body crumbled, something equally disturbing was happening to his mind. The jovial, cultured prince who had charmed ambassadors and composed music was gradually being replaced by a paranoid, cruel tyrant whose mood swings terrorized his court. Modern medical researchers examining the historical evidence have proposed various theories to explain this transformation. Some point to the jousting accident of 1536, suggesting that the 2-hour period of unconsciousness indicated a severe, traumatic brain injury. Such injuries, particularly in an era before modern medical intervention, can cause personality changes, impulse control problems, and increased aggression. Others suggest that the chronic pain itself was enough to alter Henry's personality. Modern medicine recognizes that persistent pain can rewire the brain, changing both its structure and chemistry. People suffering from chronic pain often develop depression, anxiety, and anger issues. They may become more impulsive, more prone to violent outbursts, and less capable of rational decision-making. If this was true for Henry, then every day of unrelenting pain was further damaging his ability to think clearly and control his emotions. The king, who had once been known for his learning and wit, was being slowly drowned in a sea of suffering that colored every thought and action. Some historians have also suggested that Henry might have suffered from syphilis, the sexually transmitted disease that was epidemic in Tudor England. Syphilis in its late stages can cause devastating neurological damage, leading to personality changes, paranoia, delusions, and eventually complete mental breakdown. The ulcers on his legs could have been syphilitic in origin, though the evidence for this diagnosis is not conclusive. If Henry did have syphilis, it would explain not only his physical symptoms, but also his increasingly erratic behavior. The disease, left untreated in an age before antibiotics, would have slowly destroyed his brain, even as it consumed his body. Whatever the medical cause, the change in Henry's personality was stark and terrifying. The king, who had once been generous to his friends, became suspicious of everyone. He saw conspiracies everywhere, imagining plots against his life in innocent conversations and routine events. His longtime friend and advisor, Thomas Cromwell, who had served him faithfully for years, was arrested on trumped-up charges of treason and executed. Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was beheaded on charges of adultery that were likely exaggerated, if not entirely fabricated. Even his daughter Mary, his eldest child, found herself under suspicion, forced to sign a document declaring her own mother's marriage invalid and herself a bastard. The king's rages became legendary and feared throughout his realm. He would explode over trivial matters, hurling accusations and threats with abandon. Courtiers learned to read the warning signs, the tightening of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, the way his hand would grip the arm of his chair. When these signs appeared, wise men found reasons to be elsewhere. Those too slow to leave might find themselves subjected to a tirade of abuse, accused of disloyalty or incompetence, threatened with punishment ranging from dismissal to death. And Henry, unlike many rulers, was entirely capable of carrying out his threats. Contemporary accounts paint a picture of a court living in fear. Ambassadors wrote home describing the atmosphere of tension, the way conversations would stop suddenly when the king entered a room, the care with which people chose their words in his presence. One Spanish ambassador noted that the king's servants approached him with trepidation, as if approaching a dangerous animal that might strike without warning. Musicians played not because the king loved music, but because loud noise sometimes soothed his pain and distracted him from his dark thoughts. Jesters told their jokes with forced gaiety, knowing that a joke that failed to amuse might be their last. Henry's paranoia extended even to his physicians. Despite depending on them to dress his wounds and manage his pain, he frequently accused them of incompetence or even malice. He suspected them of gossiping about his condition, of laughing at his infirmities, of deliberately applying painful treatments. Several royal physicians found themselves dismissed or even imprisoned for minor perceived failures. This made treating the king extraordinarily difficult. His doctors had to balance their professional knowledge against the king's beliefs about his own body, which were often completely at odds with medical reality. A physician who too strongly contradicted the king's self-diagnosis might find himself unemployed or worse. The mental deterioration was not constant, but came in waves. Henry would have periods of relative lucidity when the brilliant, charming man he had once been would briefly resurface. During these times, he could still conduct the business of government with his old skill, could debate theology with scholars, could even display flashes of his former wit and humor. But these periods grew shorter and less frequent as the years passed. The darkness would always return, flooding back over his mind like a tide, dragging him down into suspicion, rage, and paranoia. By the end of his life, the clear intervals were so brief and so rare that his council had learned to conduct the essential business of government during his absences or episodes of confusion, knowing that waiting for a sustained period of royal clarity might mean waiting forever. The nightmare of Henry's condition was not confined to his private chambers. The king's failing body and mind had profound effects on the governance of England and the lives of those around him. Unlike modern heads of state, who can delegate authority or step back from active rule during illness, Henry VIII was an absolute monarch in an age when royal power was personal and direct. Every significant decision required his approval, every major policy bore his stamp, every execution needed his signature. When the king was incapacitated by pain or confused by the fog that increasingly clouded his mind, the entire machinery of government ground to a halt. Henry's Privy Council, the body of advisors who helped him govern, found themselves in an impossible position. They had to wait for the king's clear moments to obtain decisions on critical matters, never knowing when such moments might come or how long they would last. Ambassadors from foreign powers, arriving to negotiate treaties or discuss alliances, might wait for weeks to see the king, only to find him too ill or too confused to conduct meaningful discussions. Important documents piled up unsigned on his desk, waiting for days when his pain was manageable enough for him to focus on reading and writing. The king's physical decline also created a succession crisis that cast a dark shadow over English politics. Henry had broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and executed 2 of his wives, all in the pursuit of a legitimate male heir. His son, Edward, born to Jane Seymour in 1537, was sickly from birth, and there was no guarantee he would survive to adulthood. Henry had 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, but both had been declared illegitimate at various points, and the idea of a woman ruling England in her own right was almost unthinkable to Tudor minds. As Henry's health worsened, factions formed around the potential heirs, each trying to position themselves for advantage when the king finally died. The king's unpredictability made court life a dangerous game. Men and women who had been in favor one day might find themselves arrested the next, with no clear understanding of what had changed. Thomas Cromwell, who had served as Henry's chief minister and orchestrated much of the English Reformation, was arrested in June 1540 and executed a month later. His crime appeared to be nothing more than arranging a marriage to Anne of Cleves that the king found physically unattractive. The speed of his fall shocked the court and served as a stark reminder that no one, no matter how powerful or how long they had served, was safe from the king's wrath. Henry's queen suffered most directly from his deteriorating condition. His 5th wife, Catherine Howard, was barely 20 years old when she married the 50-year-old king. She had been raised in a chaotic household with little supervision and even less education about the dangers of court life. Within 2 years of their marriage, she was accused of adultery and executed. Modern historians debate whether she was actually unfaithful or whether Henry's paranoia and impotence led him to imagine betrayal where none existed. Whatever the truth, the young queen paid the ultimate price for marrying a man whose body and mind were equally diseased. His 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, survived only through a combination of intelligence, tact, and extraordinary luck. When the king, in one of his paranoid episodes, signed a warrant for her arrest on charges of heresy, she managed to talk her way back into his favor by claiming she had only debated religion with him to take his mind off his pain. This excuse, transparent though it was, satisfied Henry's ego enough to save her life. But she lived in constant awareness that one misstep, one wrong word spoken on a day when the king's leg was particularly painful, could send her to the same fate as Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. The king's condition also had profound effects on religious policy in England. Henry had broken with Rome not from Protestant conviction, but from a desire to annul his first marriage. In his mind, he remained Catholic in all essential doctrines. But as his health declined, his religious policies lurched back and forth with his moods. He would order Protestant reforms one month, then persecute reformers the next. Catholics who refused to accept his supremacy over the English Church were executed as traitors, while Protestants who denied transubstantiation were burned as heretics. The result was a climate of terror, in which no one could be entirely sure what beliefs were safe to hold. The human cost of Henry's condition extended beyond the political class to ordinary people throughout his kingdom. His wars in France and Scotland, partly driven by a desire to prove his continued vigor, and partly by the aggressive impulses of his damaged brain, drained the treasury and cost thousands of English lives. His dissolution of the monasteries, which might have been carried out more humanely by a healthier, more rational monarch, led to significant social disruption and suffering. The monks and nuns who had lived in these institutions for their entire lives were turned out with minimal pensions. The poor who had depended on monastic charity found their support suddenly withdrawn. The beautiful buildings and precious objects accumulated over centuries were sold off or destroyed, a cultural catastrophe driven partly by financial need, but partly by the king's increasingly uncontrolled rage against anything that reminded him of papal authority. As Henry's physical condition deteriorated, the daily routines of managing his care became increasingly elaborate and disturbing. The king's privy chamber, the most intimate part of the royal household, expanded to include a small army of servants whose sole purpose was to attend to his failing body. The gentlemen of the privy chamber, noblemen who had once competed for the honor of serving the king closely, now found themselves performing tasks that were as degrading as they were necessary. They helped hoist him from his bed, supported him when he needed to relieve himself, and assisted in the constant changing and cleaning of his wound dressings. The king's bedchamber had become a site of medical horror. Beside his enormous bed stood tables laden with medical instruments and supplies. There were bowls of clean water and stacks of fresh linen for bandages. Jars and bottles contained various ointments, tinctures, and poultices. Sharp instruments for probing and draining wounds lay ready for use. The room reeked of herbs and incense, which were burned constantly in an attempt to mask the smell of infection and decay. Despite these efforts, the odor of rotting flesh permeated the space, a constant reminder of the corruption eating away at the king's body. The morning ritual of unwrapping and treating the king's legs could take hours. First, the old bandages had to be carefully removed, a painful process as the linen often stuck to the wound. The king would grip the arms of his chair, his face contorted with pain, while his physicians slowly peeled away the soaked fabric. Once the wounds were exposed, they had to be cleaned. This involved washing away the accumulated pus and dead tissue with various solutions, some containing wine or vinegar, others made from boiled herbs. The pain of this cleaning was intense, and even the king, who prided himself on his courage, would sometimes cry out. After cleaning came the application of treatments. The physicians would pack the wounds with various substances intended to promote healing. Sometimes they used bread soaked in milk, sometimes honey mixed with herbs, sometimes caustic preparations meant to burn away dead tissue. These treatments were applied not just to the surface of the wound, but pushed deep into the fistulous tunnels that honeycombed his flesh. Probes were inserted to measure the depth of the channels and to ensure they were draining properly. Then came fresh bandages, wrapped tightly around the leg to hold the dressings in place and to provide some support to the damaged tissues. The toll this daily torture took on Henry's mental state cannot be overstated. Every morning brought fresh agony, the certain knowledge that he would have to endure yet another session of excruciating treatment. He could not look forward to his days beginning without pain, could not wake without immediately remembering the ordeal that awaited him. This constant anticipation of suffering, combined with the suffering itself, ground away at his sanity. He became more irritable, more prone to sudden rages, more suspicious of everyone around him. The physicians who caused him pain, even in the name of healing, became objects of his anger and distrust. But the wound care was not the only indignity Henry had to endure. His massive size and limited mobility meant he required assistance with almost every aspect of daily life. Dressing him was a major undertaking, requiring multiple servants to manipulate the heavy, elaborate clothing around his bulk. His doublets had to be pulled on over his head and arms, then laced or buttoned closed across his expanded chest and belly. His hose had to be carefully drawn up over his swollen legs, avoiding the bandaged wounds. Even putting on his shoes required help, as he could no longer bend to reach his own feet. Eating, once one of Henry's great pleasures, had become complicated by his physical condition. He still possessed a voracious appetite, but his enormous girth made it difficult to lean forward to reach his plate. Special tables were constructed that could be positioned close to his body, with cutouts to accommodate his belly. Even then, servants often had to assist him, cutting his meat into pieces and sometimes even holding cups to his lips. The king, who had once led his court in elaborate banquets, now ate in partial seclusion, embarrassed by his need for assistance, yet unwilling to moderate the appetite that had contributed to his predicament. Perhaps most humiliating of all were his elimination needs. Henry could no longer walk to a privy or commode without assistance. A special close stool, essentially an elaborate portable toilet, was kept constantly near him. Servants had to help him rise, support him as he walked the few steps to the stool, assist him in arranging his clothing, and then remain nearby in case he needed help rising again. The process robbed him of the last shreds of privacy and dignity. These same servants would then have to empty and clean the close stool, a task that must have been particularly unpleasant given the king's health issues. That noblemen competed for positions in the privy chamber, knowing full well that such duties awaited them, speaks to the power and patronage that proximity to the king still conveyed, even a king in such a degraded physical state. By the mid-1540s, Henry VIII had become effectively trapped within his own palaces. The king, who had once traveled constantly, moving between his numerous residences to hunt, to escape the plague, or simply for a change of scenery, now found such movements almost impossible. Each relocation required weeks of preparation. Special litters had to be readied, roads had to be surveyed, and sometimes improved to ensure they could bear the weight of the king's carriage, and advance parties had to ensure that his destination was equipped with the specialized furniture and medical supplies he required. The spontaneous royal progresses of his youth, when he might decide to visit a subject's home with only a few days' notice, were no longer possible. Even movement within a palace had become a challenge. Henry's residences had to be modified to accommodate his condition. Ramps were constructed where there had been stairs. Doorways were widened to allow passage of his chair. Special chairs on wheels were commissioned, allowing him to be pushed from room to room rather than having to walk. In some palaces, elaborate pulley systems were installed to hoist the king up staircases when moving between floors was unavoidable. These contraptions, essentially large baskets or platforms attached to ropes and winches, would be operated by teams of strong men who would haul the king up while he sat or stood, holding onto supports to keep his balance. The king's immobility had a claustrophobic effect on his mind, where once he could ride away from troubles or problems, could lose himself in the physical exertion of the hunt or the joust, now he was trapped with his thoughts and his pain. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of his chambers and the few rooms he could reach. He saw the same walls, the same tapestries, the same faces day after day. The monotony, combined with the constant pain, created a kind of psychological pressure that manifested in increasingly erratic behavior. He would fly into rages over minor matters, then sink into deep depressions where he would refuse to see anyone, even his closest advisors. Sleep offered little respite. Henry's bed, enormous and specially constructed to support his weight, had become a place of torment. The pain in his legs made it difficult to find a comfortable position. He would wake frequently, sometimes crying out in pain, sometimes from nightmares. His servants, who slept in the adjoining rooms, learned to recognize the sounds that meant the king was awake and in distress. They would hurry to his side, ready to adjust his pillows, bring him wine, or simply stand vigil until he fell asleep again. The king's insomnia meant that his household enjoyed little rest, as they had to be ready to attend him at any hour of the day or night. The isolation of his condition affected Henry's relationships with everyone around him. He had always been a social creature, loving music, dance, and witty conversation, but increasingly he found himself alone. His pain made it difficult to concentrate on conversation. His mood swings made people reluctant to seek his company unless duty required it. His physical appearance, so changed from his youthful glory, became a source of shame that he tried to hide. He would sometimes refuse to see ambassadors or other visitors, claiming illness or pressing business, but in reality unable to face strangers who might remember the handsome young king he had once been. His relationship with his children was particularly affected by his condition. His son Edward, the longed-for male heir, was kept at some distance from his father, partly for fear of disease, partly because the king's unpredictable temper made him unsuitable company for a young child. His daughter Mary had been traumatized by years of her father's rejection and hostility. His daughter Elizabeth, who would later become England's greatest queen, was only a child during Henry's last years, but she would remember the fear and tension that surrounded her father. None of his children knew the vigorous, charming father of his younger days. They knew only the pain-racked, paranoid tyrant of his decline. The king's isolation was made worse by his position. An ordinary man, suffering as Henry suffered, might find comfort in the sympathy of friends or family, might share his fears and frustrations with loved ones. But a king could show no weakness, could admit no fear. To do so would undermine the very foundations of his authority. So Henry suffered alone, unable to share the full depth of his physical agony or mental anguish with anyone. His physicians saw his body, but could not be allowed to see into his mind. His advisors dealt with his decisions, but could not question the reasoning behind them. His wives shared his bed, but not his innermost thoughts and fears. This enforced solitude, this inability to truly connect with another human being about the horror of his condition, may have been the cruelest aspect of Henry's nightmare. He was surrounded by people, never truly alone, yet profoundly isolated by the barriers of rank, protocol, and his own deteriorating mental state. He lived within a prison constructed partly by his failing body, partly by the demands of kingship, and partly by his own psychology. As the years passed and his condition worsened, the walls of this prison grew thicker and higher, until by the end he was almost completely cut off from genuine human contact, a lonely, suffering figure trapped within a mountain of diseased flesh and a mind increasingly clouded by pain and paranoia. In the spring of 1546, those closest to Henry VIII began to realize that the king was dying. His condition, which had been deteriorating for years, was now in its final stage. The ulcers on his legs had grown worse despite all treatments, weeping constantly and filling his chambers with the stench of decay. His periods of lucidity were becoming shorter and less frequent. His massive body, which had once seemed a testament to his appetites and power, now appeared more like a monstrous burden that his failing heart and lungs could barely sustain. He struggled to breathe, especially at night, his chest heaving with the effort of drawing air into his congested lungs. Henry's physicians knew the end was near, but they dared not tell him. To predict the death of a monarch was considered treason, a crime punishable by death. So they maintained the fiction that their treatments were working, that the king was improving, even as they watched him slip further away. They increased the frequency of bloodletting, a treatment that modern medicine knows would only have hastened his decline. They applied ever more elaborate poultices and prescribed increasingly complicated mixtures of herbs and medicines. Nothing helped. The king's body had passed beyond the point where any medical intervention, Tudor or modern, could have saved him. The king himself seemed to sense his approaching end, though he would not acknowledge it openly. He made arrangements for his son's minority, dictating detailed instructions for the council that would govern England until Edward came of age. He became obsessed with his tomb, ordering elaborate plans for a monument that would surpass anything ever built for an English king. He spoke often of his father, Henry VII, and of his grandfather, Edward IV, as if preparing to join them. But he never admitted, even to himself, that he was dying. To do so would be to acknowledge defeat, and Henry VIII had never learned how to lose. As the months wore on, Henry's appearance became increasingly shocking. His face, once handsome, had become bloated and discolored. His body, already massive, had swollen even further as his heart failed and fluid accumulated in his tissues. His legs, ravaged by the ulcers, had become grotesque, the healthy tissue between the wounds edematous and discolored. He could no longer stand without support and could walk only a few steps with the aid of servants. Most of the time, he remained in his chair or bed, a vast, suffering mass of diseased flesh that bore little resemblance to the athletic young king who had ascended the throne 38 years earlier. His mental state in these final months was pitiable. The paranoia that had marked his later years intensified. He suspected everyone of plotting against him, of waiting impatiently for his death so they could seize power. He accused his closest advisors of disloyalty, his servants of stealing from him, his physicians of hastening his death. Some of these suspicions had basis in reality. His council was indeed positioning themselves for the power struggle that would follow his death, dividing into factions that supported different visions for Edward's regency. But Henry saw conspiracies that did not exist, imagined betrayals that were never planned, and lashed out at innocent men and women who had done nothing but serve him faithfully. In December 1546, Henry fell seriously ill with what may have been a severe infection related to his leg ulcers. For several weeks, he hovered between life and death, barely conscious, racked with fever. His physicians despaired, believing the end had finally come. But Henry, with the stubborn strength that had marked his entire reign, refused to die. He rallied, regaining some measure of strength, though he never truly recovered. From this point forward, he was clearly living on borrowed time. His body sustained more by force of will than by any remaining vitality. The Christmas season of 1546 was the last Henry would see. The festivities at court were muted, everyone aware that the king's health hung by a thread. Henry himself could barely participate in the celebrations. He watched from his chair as younger men danced and drank, a spectator at revels he had once led. When musicians played, he sometimes tapped his fingers in rhythm, a shadow of the king who had once composed his own music. When singers performed carols, tears would sometimes run down his bloated cheeks, though whether from emotion, pain, or simply the physical effects of his failing body, no one could say. By January 1547, it was clear to everyone, probably including Henry himself, that the end was very near. The king took to his bed too weak to rise even with assistance. His breathing became increasingly labored, a terrible rattling sound that filled his chamber. The ulcers on his legs, untended properly because moving him caused too much pain, began to show signs of gangrene. The characteristic smell of dying tissue joined the other odors in the king's chamber. His physicians knew that nothing more could be done. They kept him as comfortable as possible with wine and opiates, waiting for the inevitable end. The most powerful man in England, who had defied popes and executed 2 queens, who had reshaped his nation's religion and politics according to his will, was now helpless, dying by inches in his enormous bed, his body finally succumbing to the diseases that had tormented him for so long. On January 27, 1547, Henry VIII woke from a fitful sleep to find that he could barely breathe. The congestion in his lungs had worsened overnight, and each breath was a struggle. His physicians, who had been keeping constant vigil, immediately recognized that the end was at hand. But here they faced a terrible dilemma. Tudor law and custom dictated that a dying monarch should be told of their condition so they could make final preparations, receive last rites, and settle any remaining earthly business. However, the law also stated that anyone who predicted the death of the monarch was guilty of treason. The physicians, caught between these contradictory requirements, hesitated to act. Finally, one of the king's closest attendants, a man named Sir Anthony Denny, took the responsibility upon himself. He approached the king's bedside and gently told Henry that in the opinion of his physicians, he was unlikely to live much longer. It was time, Denny said, to prepare his soul and make his peace with God. For once, Henry did not explode in anger or deny the reality before him. Perhaps he was too weak, or perhaps he had finally accepted what his body had been telling him for months. He asked for Archbishop Cranmer to be summoned, but then lapsed into unconsciousness before Cranmer could arrive. Throughout that day and into the night, Henry drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he would wake and try to speak, but his words were confused and rambling, a mixture of prayer, political instructions, and fragments of memory. He called for long-dead friends and advisors, as if they were still alive and could help him. He spoke of his father and of his youth, of hunts and tournaments that had taken place decades earlier. He asked for his children, but they were not there. Edward was kept away to protect him from infection, while Mary and Elizabeth had not been summoned, perhaps because Henry's advisors feared what the dying king might say or do in his delirium. Archbishop Cranmer arrived late that night, having been delayed by distance and bad weather. He found the king barely conscious, unable to speak coherently. Cranmer took Henry's hand and asked him to give some sign if he believed in Christ and trusted in his mercy for salvation. The king, with what may have been his last conscious act, squeezed Cranmer's hand. It was a small gesture, but for those present it was enough. Whatever Henry VIII had been in life, whatever horrors he had committed, whatever suffering he had caused, he went to his grave having made at least a token acknowledgement of his faith and need for divine mercy. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning on January 28, 1547, Henry VIII died. According to those present, his passing was surprisingly peaceful. His labored breathing simply slowed and then stopped. There was no final struggle, no dramatic last words, no great scene. The man who had lived so large, who had made his will, felt across Europe and changed the course of English history, slipped away quietly in the darkness of a winter night. For a few moments, the attendants simply stood there, looking at the massive body lying still in the enormous bed, as if unable to believe that the force of nature that had been Henry VIII had finally been extinguished. But death did not end Henry's nightmare. His body, so diseased and swollen in life, presented enormous challenges in death. According to tradition, a king's body would lie in state so his subjects could pay their respects, but Henry's advisors were reluctant to display the corpse. The ulcers had made embalming difficult, if not impossible in some areas, and there was concern about what would happen to the body as it began to decompose. Nevertheless, the body was prepared as well as possible and placed in a lead coffin, which was then enclosed in a wooden case. This coffin was so heavy that it required dozens of men to carry it. A disturbing legend arose around Henry's funeral. According to some accounts, as the king's coffin rested overnight in Sion Abbey on its way to Windsor Castle for burial, it burst open. The lead lining, unable to contain the decomposing body, had given way. By morning, dogs were found licking at the remains that had leaked from the coffin. Whether this story is true or apocryphal is uncertain, but it circulated widely in the years after Henry's death. Some saw it as divine judgment, a fulfillment of a prophecy made years earlier that dogs would lick Henry's blood just as they had licked the blood of the biblical king Ahab. Others saw it simply as a final indignity visited upon a body that had suffered so much in life. Henry VIII was finally laid to rest in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, beside Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his longed-for son. The elaborate tomb he had planned was never completed. The religious changes that came after his death, the political turmoil of his son's short reign, and his daughter Mary's attempted Catholic restoration, all conspired to leave Henry with a far simpler memorial than he had envisioned. Today, his grave is marked by a simple black stone, installed in the 19th century. It bears his name and dates, nothing more. The man who had wanted a monument that would eclipse all others lies beneath a floor slab that most visitors walk over without noticing, unaware that they are treading on the grave of one of England's most extraordinary and terrible monarchs. The nightmare that Henry VIII lived through offers a haunting window into the intersection of power, disease, and mortality. Here was a man who possessed absolute authority over one of Europe's most powerful nations, who could order executions with a word and reshape his country's religion to suit his needs, yet who was ultimately powerless against the decay of his own flesh. All his wealth could not buy effective medical treatment. All his authority could not command his body to heal. All his will could not hold back the tide of corruption that spread through his tissues. The king who made others tremble lived his final years in a state of constant fear. Fear of pain, fear of death, fear of the humiliation his condition brought him. Modern medical analysis of Henry's case provides insights that his Tudor physicians could never have achieved. The ulcers that tormented him were likely caused by a combination of factors including poor circulation, repeated trauma to his legs, possible diabetes, and perhaps an autoimmune condition. The obesity that helped create and exacerbate these problems was itself the result of hormonal issues, possibly Cushing's syndrome or a similar disorder, combined with lack of exercise and overconsumption of food. His personality changes, the paranoia and rage that marked his later years, could have resulted from traumatic brain injury, from the psychological effects of chronic pain, from possible syphilis, or from all of these factors working together. But knowing the medical causes does not diminish the horror of Henry's experience. He lived for over a decade with wounds that would not heal, in a body that had betrayed him, with a mind that increasingly could not be trusted. Every day brought fresh pain and fresh humiliation. Every night offered only fitful rest, interrupted by agony. He watched his body transform from the athletic ideal he had been in youth to a grotesque mockery, unable to stop the transformation. He felt his mind slipping, experienced the paranoid thoughts and violent impulses, but lacked the insight to recognize them as symptoms of disease rather than justified responses to genuine threats. The people around Henry suffered too, though in different ways. His wives lived in constant danger, knowing that a word spoken on the wrong day, when the king's leg was particularly painful, might be their last. His advisors had to navigate between their duty to serve their country and their need to placate an increasingly unstable monarch. His servants had to tend to his disgusting wounds and failing body, while maintaining the fiction that they served a powerful, dignified king. His children grew up in the shadow of his deterioration, marked by the experience of having such a father. The entire court, indeed the entire nation, lived with the consequences of having a ruler whose judgment was compromised by disease. Henry's legacy is complex and controversial. He is remembered as the king who established the Church of England, breaking with Rome and setting in motion the English Reformation. He is remembered as a tyrant who executed 2 wives, numerous advisors, and thousands of others who opposed him. He is remembered as a Renaissance prince, a patron of arts and learning. He is remembered as a serial husband whose marital adventures changed the course of history. But perhaps he should also be remembered as a man trapped in a nightmare, a prisoner of his own failing body, whose suffering, while not excusing his cruelty, helps explain the darkness of his later years. The story of Henry VIII's physical decline raises uncomfortable questions about power and human frailty. In modern democracies, mechanisms exist to remove leaders who become incapacitated, whether physically or mentally. But in Tudor England, there was no such recourse. A king ruled until death, no matter how compromised his faculties might be. This meant that Henry's personal nightmare became England's nightmare, as the policies and decisions of a pain-racked, paranoid, failing man shaped the fate of millions. How many people died because Henry's aching leg made him cruel that day? How many wives might have been spared if his physicians had possessed modern antibiotics? How different might English history have been if the vigorous young Henry had lived to be the wise old king his early promise suggested he might become? Yet there is something almost tragically human about Henry's story. Strip away the crown and the historical significance, and you find a person suffering in ways that remain comprehensible and pitiable even across 5 centuries. the pain of ulcers that would not heal, the humiliation of needing help with basic bodily functions, the frustration of a mind that no longer worked as it should, the fear of approaching death. These are experiences that transcend time and rank. They remind us that beneath the robes and crown, beneath the historical significance and the terrible deeds, Henry VIII was simply a man, as vulnerable to disease and death as any beggar in his kingdom. The nightmare within King Henry VIII was not just his physical decay or his mental deterioration. It was the profound isolation of his suffering, the impossibility of truly sharing his pain with others, the requirement that he maintain the appearance of majesty even as his body fell apart. It was the knowledge that his condition was worsening, that no treatment was working, that death was approaching, but might take years to arrive. It was the transformation from the man he had been to the thing he was becoming, a transformation he was helpless to prevent. It was living in a body that had become a prison and a torture chamber combined, from which death would be the only release. As we look back across the centuries at the enormous, ulcerated, paranoid figure that Henry VIII became, it is easy to see only the tyrant, the wife-killer, the destroyer of monasteries. But we should also see the human tragedy, the slow catastrophe of a body's failure and a mind's decay. We should see a man trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape, who handled his suffering with neither grace nor courage, but with all the flawed humanity that marks our species. King Henry VIII was hiding a nightmare within, not just in the literal sense of his diseased body, but in the psychological and existential horror of his condition. And that nightmare, in the end, consumed not just the king himself, but cast its dark shadow across an entire nation and an entire age.